Good day. Today is 4th October, marking the start of the 5th month of Ukraine's offensive, the one which was launched on the 4th of June and which has continued relentlessly ever since. It was going to be the spring offensive, then it became the summer offensive. Now, if we believe some commentary, it is the autumn offensive. Before long, according again to some other people, it will become the winter offensive. And of course, some commentary in the West speaks of it becoming the spring offensive again next year. Allegedly, supposedly, reputedly, Ukraine is going to go back on the attack in the spring of 2024 and will continue its offensive then. Anyway, shortly after I made my last video, in which I pointed out that Sergei Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, is now talking about this offensive as having failed, as to it having been defeated. A comment, by the way, which elicited a rather odd response from the Institute for the Study of War. They said that Shoigu was rewarding commanders and military units which had engaged in pointless counterattacks. That's how the Institute of the Study of War construed some of Shoigu's comments, awarding decorations to particular units and soldiers. I'm not going to waste time analysing that statement. But anyway, even as Shoigu spoke and said that the offensive has, to all intents and purposes, failed, and shortly after I did my video, perhaps predictably, and as in this case night follows day, the Ukrainians carried out a whole series of new attacks yesterday, trying to keep the offensive, or at least the narrative of the offensive, alive. And throughout yesterday, late into the evening, late into the night in fact, reports poured in of Ukrainian attacks, infantry attacks, towards a village called Kopani, which is actually located somewhere to the west of Rabotino, of the Ukrainians trying to reach and capture Kopani. And there was apparently fierce fighting in this area, and all the reports also spoke of the Ukrainians attacking on foot, without armoured vehicles, with some artillery support, but encountering fierce opposition from the Russians. Now, the night went on, the reports gradually melted away, and this morning, so far as I can tell, the situation around Kopani, or to the east of Rabotino, remains as before. Now, I say that there hasn't actually been a great deal of information about what actually took place over the course of all this fighting. But anyway, that does seem to be the most likely explanation of the outcome. I would have expected that if there had been some kind of breakthrough, if the Ukrainians had successfully pierced the Russian defences around Kopani in some meaningful way, well, by now there would be news about it, and so far there has been none. There is also, by the way, more Ukrainian attacks in the Klishayevka area. The reports that the Russians were retaliating, this time not just with artillery, but Russian helicopter gunships had been in operation. Again, fighting supposedly very fierce, but again, apparently the fighting ultimately, eventually repelled. Now, to get a sense of how extensive this fighting is, if I can go back to the case of the fighting for Kopani, it seems that the Ukrainian attack in that direction was carried out by 2 companies of Ukrainian infantry. That would amount to around 200 men, assuming these companies were up to strength. Now, of course, I might be getting this wrong. It may be that more companies were involved and the 200 men who launched this attack towards Kopani were part of a larger group and were rotating. It's entirely plausible. I don't know. But again, it does give one a sense of the nature of these battles. For the time being, at least, they are small-scale, piecemeal affairs. They can be very intense. The fighting can be very brutal and very hard. The cumulative losses that arise from them can be enormous because, of course, this infantry is attacking across open fields, mined open fields, and, of course, the Russian guns and machine guns and the Russian soldiers in the trenches are waiting for them as they come. So the losses amongst these piecemeal groups, these penny packet unit groups of Ukrainian soldiers who attack towards these positions must be very heavy indeed, but it remains the case that at any one time, only a relatively small number of troops are actually involved in these battles and in these attempts by the Ukrainians to break through. Now, alongside all of this activity, the Ukrainians once again resumed their attacks towards Crimea. And there were again attempts to land parties of, special forces troops in speedboats or other kinds of boats on the promontory in Crimea. When it happens, the Ukrainians land, they wave their flag, they get photographed, they jump back into the boats, and they flee and return back to their bases. They don't try to establish any permanent positions there. The Russians claim that at least one of these boats was caught by Russian aircraft and destroyed on the sea, and that all of the men in it were killed. Apparently some other Ukrainian troops attacked on water skis, or water jets, I should say, not water skis, water jets. Anyway, I have to say that if it weren't for the fact that men are being killed in these operations, they have a frankly farcical quality. At least to me they do. The purpose of these stunts, which is what they are, is difficult to understand. They don't establish, as I said, a permanent presence in Crimea. They result in people being killed. They are once more a part of Ukraine's strategy of public relations, paid as far as I can see in blood. Anyway, alongside these, as I said, bizarre James Bond type operations, which are resulting in brave men being killed, the Ukrainians also seem to have launched cruise missiles towards Ukraine. The Russians identified them as Neptune anti-ship missiles, apparently produced by Ukraine itself, but modified into some kind of land attack role. Anyway, the Russians claimed that all of the missiles, I gather there were two, but I might be wrong about that, all of the missiles were shot down. And there are also some reports that the Ukrainians launched a big drone offensive towards Russia. Large numbers of drones were involved. But again, it's difficult to get a complete picture or exact picture of what happened. Suffice to say that from what I can tell, most of the drones, perhaps all of them, were shot down by the Russians or brought down by the Russian air defense systems using electronic warfare techniques or whatever. Certainly, nothing seems to have happened that has changed the situation militarily in any significant way. And by the way, on the subject of drones, there's been an article, a piece in the Washington Post. It basically admits that the Russians are now winning the battle of the drones. It quotes a Ukrainian commander as saying that it's like a chess game. They're winning it, they being the Russians. And apparently it is difficult to counter Russian drones. Russian troops use drones to hit minor targets or deploy 2 drones at once, which suggests a deeper inventory. And a Ukrainian unit produces about 20 drones a day, but that is nowhere near enough drones. And by contrast, the Russians seem to have no limit to their supply of drones. Anyway, that's in fact all of the evidence is that the Russians are now building drones on an industrial scale and that they're starting to swamp the Ukrainian drone efforts, such as they are. By the way, there have also been reports that a lot of these drones that the Ukrainians use have Chinese origins, and it's become increasingly difficult for Ukraine to source these drones because the Chinese are tightening up exports of these drones to Ukraine. And the Ukrainians are also having difficulty getting components to make these drones themselves, and that this is also having some kind of a problem for them. Suffice to say that Western countries do not produce these kind of small drones, surveillance and attack drones that have come to dominate the fighting in this war. At least they don't do so in anything like the kind of industrial quantities that this war requires. So anyway, that's the Washington Post. The Ukrainians are losing the drone war. In the meantime, the Russians have been again continuing in their daily attacks on Ukrainian targets across Ukraine with drones and missiles, a variety of missiles. This has now become routine. There's been various expressions of concern within Ukraine that the Ukrainian energy system is in bad shape. There's even been a piece in The Economist which basically says that the repairs that needed to be done after the Russian missile and drone offensive on the energy system last year have not been done, and it is in a much more fragile and precarious position than it was last year. But I have to say that for the moment, the Russians don't seem to be interested in carrying out a missile offensive against the energy system in the way that they were last year. As I have discussed now in several programs, it's become increasingly clear to me that the true purpose of the Russian missile offensive on the energy system was not so much to knock out the energy system itself as to deplete Ukraine's air defenses, its S-300, especially its S-300 missile defenses, which were a formidable air defense asset which Ukraine possessed and which severely restricted the operation of the Russian Air Force over Ukraine. And that task has been largely successful, with Western missile systems deployed to Ukraine unable to fill the gap to anything like the same degree, and with the result that the Russian Air Force, now equipped with precision-guided bombs, is much more active than it was. So whether the Russians do in fact intend to resume a missile offensive against the Ukrainian energy system this year, that remains to be seen. But anyway, that, it seems to me, is overall the situation on the battlefronts. More Ukrainian attacks, none of which seem to me to have made any significant change to the overall picture on the battlefronts. More pointless and, in some ways, tragic or tragicomic stunts with respect to Crimea. A bizarre series of claims from Britain about Ukraine having won some great naval victory against the Russians, which I don't understand. I don't see that any of these operations that Ukraine has launched over the Black Sea over the last couple of weeks have actually changed anything or achieved anything. That's another story. But anyway, that seems to me the overall situation. In the first few hours after the anniversary of the start, the monthly anniversary, the 5-monthly anniversary of the start of Ukraine's offensive was reached. Now, all of this has been going on even as Ukraine's own position continues to deteriorate. And before I come on to the events in the United States, let me briefly touch on some comments about the demographic picture in Ukraine. There's been a whole series of articles about this, an interesting one, by the way, on the moon of Alabama, but also in other places. They all speak about the same thing, that the cumulative effect of the war is having a catastrophic effect on Ukraine's overall demographic position. But perhaps most importantly and most interestingly, at least in terms of this war, is the fact that the collapse, the demographic collapse in the war, is rather consequent upon this war, is now severely undermining both Ukraine's economy and its ability to conduct mobilizations. And the point is that the birth rate in Ukraine has apparently been very low, as it has been, by the way, right across the former Soviet Union for much of the time since the Soviet Union collapsed. There's been an increase in the birth rate, or rather there was an increase in the birth rate, a significant increase in the birth rate in Russia some years ago, though never to proper replacement levels. Then that's fallen back. There's some suggestions that it might be rising again, but suffice to say that in Ukraine, that has not been the case. The birth rate has been getting increasingly, has been falling increasingly, and is now at catastrophic levels. But the key point about this is because of the collapse of the birth rate in Ukraine, the number of young men in their 20s, those who would have made the best, almost obvious pool of soldiers for Ukraine to draw upon, was already, before the war, the fighting even began, extremely small, or relatively small, well, extremely small by comparison with other countries, and that has already limited the size of the potential mobilization base. And the effect of the war, of course, has been to cause massive damage precisely to this demographic, reduce the size of this demographic even further, which, given that it is the most fertile demographic, is going to apparently undermine still further Ukraine's prospect of recovery going forward. This war, let me repeat again, is a tragedy. It is a demographic and human tragedy. Logically, compellingly, it should end, because the damage that is being done to Ukraine, which more shortly, is catastrophic and grows more so every day. But anyway, put all that aside, let's now talk about the situation in the United States. Now, I have said in the past, and I don't take any of this back, that the previous maneuvers in Congress about the appropriations for the US budget were to a great extent theatre, and that they did not necessarily mean, or they did not mean at all, that there would be, in fact, a cut-off in financial aid for Ukraine. What a lot of people in Congress on the Republican side were objecting to was the fact that the administration, perhaps, in fact, most probably, with the agreement of the Republican congressional leadership, had sought to attach funding for Ukraine to a much bigger appropriation to cover the US government's own costs, and that this was deeply unpopular with Republicans, many of whom oppose aid for Ukraine, but was done in order both to paper over the cracks over this issue with the Republican Party, and also to prevent the issue of funding for Ukraine from becoming a topic in the forthcoming elections in the United States. And I said that the fact that the Congress had now approved appropriations for a 45-day period, but had decided that the funding for Ukraine should be treated as a separate, stand-alone issue, though it created political problems both for the administration and for the Republican leadership in Congress, did not prevent funding for Ukraine being approved by Congress, where there is a significant majority for continued funding for Ukraine. However, something has now happened over the last couple of hours, which I will say straight away, I'm probably not the best person to analyse or decipher, but which may change that picture radically. And that is that it's clear that the manoeuvres of the Republican congressional leadership, both in the House and in the Senate, infuriated some Republicans in the House. And this opened the way for Representative Gatz to demand, or rather to seek, the ouster of House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, who is, of course, or has been, nominally the leader of Republicans in the House. And there was questions about whether the Democrats in the House would support this move to oust McCarthy. And there were some suggestions that they would not, but eventually they did. It's apparently very, very difficult for Democrats to support McCarthy's position as Speaker, because he's unpopular, presumably, with the Democratic Party's base. He was loyal to Donald Trump whilst Donald Trump was president, and after the events on January 6th, he did criticise Donald Trump, but then subsequently he did seek some kind of a reconciliation with him, which has never been forgotten or forgiven, at least on the Democratic side of the aisle. Anyway, the long and the short of it was that the Democrats, apparently after some internal discussion, decided that they could not support McCarthy. So they also voted against him. And 8 Republicans, including Representative Gatz, voted against him as well, with the result being that he was voted out of the Speaker's chair by a vote of 216 to 210, and has ceased now to be House Speaker. And this is now creating, apparently, some kind of a financial or funding crisis. Now, I think, before I proceed to analyse this even further, I should say that whilst I think that anger over McCarthy's continued attempts, apparently, to obtain funding for Ukraine may have played a certain role in the decision of dissident Republicans to move against him, and all of these manoeuvres and arrangements that McCarthy has been making with the administration, and which the other leaders of the Republican Party in Congress and the Senate have also been making in order to get this funding package for Ukraine through. All of that, no doubt, has gone down badly with some Republicans. I think far more important is the fact that many Republicans in the House are deeply unhappy with the appropriations package as a whole, and that they were incensed by the fact that McCarthy reached an agreement with the administration to propel this package forward in order to get some funding for the US government, to cover funding for the US government for 45 days. In other words, what has turned sentiment in the House amongst Republicans against McCarthy was not specifically or so much Ukraine, the Ukraine funding issue, as the bigger issue of funding for the federal government. Many House Republicans are still very unhappy with the amount of appropriations that McCarthy essentially engineered for the next 45 days. They're seeking significant cuts in spending to try to bring the budget under control, or so they say. This is something, by the way, that Republicans have been saying for years. Not very much has ever managed to be done about it. But anyway, that's what they say. And they were very angry with the way in which McCarthy went behind their backs and approved this appropriation without getting their consent. Now, having said that, though this is probably not specifically Ukraine related, it has nonetheless angered Republicans, but most importantly, it has left the House without a speaker. There is a speaker, a temporary speaker, a speaker pro tempore, who is McCarthy's number 2, a gentleman by the name of Mr. Henry, but he's only the acting speaker. And it seems that without an elected speaker, it's going to be very difficult, in fact, apparently procedurally impossible for the House to approve further appropriations of any kind. At least that's the constitutional theory. I've seen some people argue otherwise, and it's been suggested that if no agreement is reached within the Republican caucus in the House about who the next speaker should be over the next few weeks, then it might be the case that Mr. Henry can simply assume the full position of Speaker and can come to some kind of arrangements on funding with the administration, and some kind of appropriations might take place. Well, I don't know whether that is the case or not. I'm not an expert on these matters. I suspect that the number of people who are is very small, and I am absolutely not one of them. But anyway, The key point is that there has been a further delay in approving funding for Ukraine, as well as for the rest of the funding that the federal government needs. And this could drag on now for weeks. The Republican caucus in the House has no agreed alternative candidate for Speaker to Mr. McCarthy. Mr. McCarthy himself has now ruled himself out as standing again for Speaker, and it looks as if the situation in Congress, in the House of Representatives, is now in flux with no clear or perhaps quick resolution to this problem. Now, I would qualify the second because sometimes, especially if opinion polls start to suggest that the wider public in the United States is not impressed and is unhappy about what is going on, then politicians can sometimes come together and reach decisions far more rapidly than anybody supposes. And personally, I would not be shocked or indeed even surprised if what some people see as a major crisis and deadlock is in fact resolved far more rapidly than people expect. But for the moment, at least, it seems as if there is deadlock about all funding, not just funding for Ukraine, notwithstanding the fact that funding for Ukraine is one of the most controversial issues. Now, I don't know how this is all ultimately going to play out. And again, some people might have some ideas, but I am not one of them. All I will say is that for at least another 1.5 months, or so it seems, the question of whether Ukraine will get funding is up in the air. And of course, if there is a government shutdown from the middle of November, then the question of further funding for Ukraine will continue to be in the air. The administration says that they still have around $6 billion left that they can eke out for Ukraine. That's not a very substantial sum of money by comparison with what the administration has been sending to Ukraine before. But who knows? No doubt, again, all kinds of creative minds will come to work and they could probably find more money soon. But of course, if there is a shutdown, the administration is going to be in something of a quandary anyway, because do they continue to send money to Ukraine at a time when other critical functions of the US government are shut down because there isn't funding for them? That might not be a popular look amongst the American people. So it could be that this is going to affect the longer term prospects of funding for Ukraine. And there's now also a real possibility that if a new speaker is elected, he might come from the populist wing of the Republican Party, and he might be required to make some pledges to some Republicans over funding for Ukraine, in which case the longer-term prospects of Congress approving more funding for Ukraine might gradually begin to ebb and melt away. Meanwhile, there is pressure from the Pentagon. The Pentagon is now apparently saying that without further funds, they don't have money to replace the weapons, the ammunition and all of that from the US's arsenals, which have already been depleted because of the amount of weapons and ammunition and equipment which has been sent to Ukraine. And the Pentagon is apparently also saying that this is putting the United States potentially in a dangerous position. And I can't help but think that this might cause some people in Congress, again, perhaps primarily on the Republican side, to question why funding should be provided to support the war in Ukraine when the priority logically ought to be to fund the Pentagon so that it can re-equip itself. So, I'm going to take back to a certain extent what I said before about the fact that the procedural arguments in Washington about the funding packages, the lumping together of Ukrainian funding with a bigger budget appropriation, the fact that that had happened, that there'd been resistance to that, and that an agreement had been reached to hive off the issue of Ukrainian funding from the larger package. I said that I didn't think that that would change the overall situation and that funding for Ukraine would eventually be approved. I'm now going to retract on that a little. It seems to me that the fall of McCarthy, an event, by the way, which I did not anticipate, has now made this issue rather more open than had previously been the case. And it could be the case that the funding for Ukraine that has been coming out of the United States is, from this point on, going to start to reduce significantly and perhaps even end. And already this is having an effect in Ukraine itself. The Ukrainian government has been paying salaries both amongst its civil bureaucracy and for the army out of funds that has been receiving from the European Union and from the United States. And they're already saying that if funding from the United States stops, then after November, they will run out of money to continue to pay for their civil service, for their civil government. Indeed, going back to a piece Eve Smith recently wrote in Naked Capitalism, if funding from the West ceases entirely, then there is no conceivable way in which Ukraine can cover its various financial obligations, both its civil obligations and its military ones. And any attempt to do so could only be done by printing money on a massive scale, and almost certainly that would cause the budget in Ukraine to collapse, and it might lead to a collapse of the currency also. In other words, to some type of hyperinflation there. Now, we're not there yet, but the alarm bells are ringing. And there are further causes for alarm, because even as some people in the European Union are pressing for an accelerated road to Ukraine's membership of the EU, a recent meeting of EU ministers also failed to agree to provide Ukraine with further military assistance. Apparently $5 billion were up for discussion, but it seems that there was no press announcement. Borrell, who chaired the meeting, was unable to broker an agreement, and the whole meeting broke up without an agreement being reached. And I can't help but think that the election in Slovakia and the election of Robert Fico, this meeting of EU foreign ministers, that was unable to approve this package took place before the Slovak election. But with Fico's election in Slovakia, the difficulty of getting more funding out of the EU is going to grow as well. Hungary and Slovakia apparently are now agreed that this should no longer happen. The European government, the European Union, is apparently trying to bribe Orban with a $13 billion funding package in order to, 13 billion euro, a funding package in order to get him to agree to the provision of further aid for Ukraine. We'll see whether he accepts the bribe, but anyway, we'll see. But in the meantime, it does seem more likely than not that countries like Slovakia and Hungary, assuming they stand their ground, are now in a stronger position to resist further aid packages for Ukraine. So it could be that further funding for Ukraine will start to dwindle from Europe also. So all of this is putting the Ukrainians and their backers under considerable pressure. Now, in the United States, the spokesman of the National Security Council, Admiral John Kirby, has now suddenly extended the time period before the start of the Rasputitsa. He says that Ukraine has between 4 and 8 weeks to conduct its breakthrough, to carry out its breakthrough, before the weather conditions make further military operations impossible or very much more difficult. Now, this, on the face of it, would delay the start of the Rasputitsa to November or even December, which is much later than I have ever heard. But anyway, the point is he's made this statement because he says that the Ukrainians are conducting advances and it is important to maintain momentum, and that is why Congress needs to approve now further aid for Ukraine. So, in effect, this reflects the administration's concern to get funding for Ukraine past Congress, rather than perhaps the weather or climatic realities in Ukraine itself, or even the situation on the ground. It's also apparently caused a very, very great deal of alarm in Kiev. And there's reports from one of the Ukrainian Telegram channels, I think it is Legitimi. They're saying that there's considerable alarm now in Kiev, that funding is now drying up, and that is going to leave Ukraine in a deeply exposed position. And this means that in order to try to recapture some of the enthusiasm for the enthusiastic support for Ukraine that had existed before, there is now increasing desperation to try and achieve some victory somewhere before year's end, and that could be what is driving these latest attacks in the Rabotino-Verbovoye sector around the village of Kopani, these attacks in Kleshayevka, and perhaps eventually, though I've been hearing less about it recently, this talk about an amphibious assault on Kherson region, the eastern bank of the Dnieper, from the west bank of the Dnieper. And Ukraine, in other words, they're now looking for some victory, because they sense that unless they get it, unless they can present something to the Western public to Congress, to people across the West, that will make more funding available, then they will be facing a crisis, even as the Russian military build-up continues and gathers pace. Now, in my program yesterday, I said that September had been a record month for military recruitment in Russia, 50,000 men joining the military. Bloomberg has now published an article about Russian military production. It's absolutely fascinating, by the way, to see how Western media, Western mainstream media, places like Bloomberg and those sort of places, are now writing articles saying things that we on independent media, by we I mean people like Brian Beletic, my colleague Alex Christoforou, myself on the Duran, others, started saying a year ago. I mean, they've left it about a year late, but we're now, they're now finally catching up. Not only is Russia not running out of ammunition, not running out of missiles, not running out of tanks, none of that. I mean, of course, there are some people who still insist that it is. Admiral Radakin and Ben Wallace in Britain still insisting that half of Russia's military has been destroyed in this war, something which is a delusional claim, as discussed many times. But anyway, places like Bloomberg are now admitting that which we have been saying for so long, that Russian military production is surging. It's growing at double-digit rates, and there is no sign that it is slowing down. This growth is slowing down. The Russians are producing every conceivable type of weapon in increasing numbers. And as I discussed in my program yesterday, they are even busy, apparently, with developments of weapon systems which are not directly related to the special military operations. So apparently we're going to have the first flight of the new interceptor, the MiG-41, before very long. We're going to have another test of the nuclear-powered Borisovnik cruise missile. Neither of these systems is relevant for the special military operation, but the Russians apparently have funding to proceed with development of these systems as well. And by the way, there's been more reports from the Russians about the state of their budget now. They apparently are receiving a huge surge of funds. Oil energy revenues have now largely been restored. And of course, Russia is benefiting in terms of its revenue position from the weakness of the ruble. Now, this is a controversial topic. It's been one that many people have pushed back against me on. There was a piece, by the way, some weeks ago by Ambrose Evans Pritchard talking about how it's nonsense, essentially, to claim that the soft ruble was all about the budget, that the Russian authorities actually wanted a soft ruble at this time because the budget, because it meant that Russian exports were producing bigger, larger amounts of rubles than they would otherwise have done, which would support the budget. There was even a piece a short time ago in The Economist saying that the war is starting to bite into Russian living standards. And again, the primary reason for this was the soft ruble. Reality is, because the ruble has again become softer, it was briefly once more above 100 rubles to, or below, it once was once more trading at 100 rubles to the to the dollar, and might again, by the way. It's not impossible, but because of this, the reality is that at a time when oil prices are rising, this is working again to the advantage of the Russian budget. Because, of course, it means that such oil as Russia is selling in dollars, and admittedly, mostly now, it sells its dollars for other currencies, RMB to China, and other currencies with other countries, to the extent that Russia is, however, still selling a significant part of its oil in dollars. It means that it is getting many more rubles for the dollars that it receives, or in which it is being paid, than it would otherwise do. And that supports the budget. And by the way, the ruble has also depreciated against the RMB, which means also that this supports the budget, with the RMB becoming an increasingly important currency, trading currency, within the basket of currencies that now are used in Russia. Now, that this is the case, that this is what is actually happening, was demonstrated by the cool, calm response to the recent softening of the ruble, which, by the way, and incidentally, is partly a reflection, or mostly a reflection, of the recent strengthening of the dollar following the revelations in the United States that interest rates are going to remain high for longer than had been expected previously. But anyway, in Russia, Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, when asked about the ruble, he simply shrugged his shoulders and said that this is an anachronistic issue, doesn't really mean much anymore. The situation on the within the domestic economy is what really matters. Russia isn't really part of the dollar system to any great extent any longer. As I said yesterday, it's now outlawed use of SWIFT, even within its own territory, for transfers amongst Russian banks. So, as I said, Peskov simply shrugged his shoulders and basically said, so what? Now, of course, some Russians are affected, those who want to travel to the West, and some still do, though it's very complicated and expensive for them to do it. It's going to become even more complicated. But amongst Russians like that, this is a limited, the number of Russians who are in a position to do that is now, comparatively speaking, rather small. Inflation in Russia is higher, but it is under control. The central bank has said that they're going to be tightening monetary policy, and they still predict that inflation will fall back to 4% by the end of next year. So, anyway, coming back to Bloomberg, they're admitting that there has been this enormous surge in Russian military production, with the huge increase in revenues for the Russian budget. That means, in turn, that the Russians can continue to afford to fund this increase. In fact, can I just say, even if energy receipts had been lower, there is more than enough capital in Russia to do this. And all of this is happening at one and the same time, that Ukraine is running out of money, or at least that its funding position is becoming increasingly unstable and insecure with these developments in the United States, when its offensive has ground to a stop, and when supplies of weapons from the West are starting to run down. Now, it is hopeless to give this advice, but the correct course for the Kiev authorities to follow, obviously, at this point, is to try to contact the Russians, or perhaps not the Russians directly, but countries like China, which Russia would have to listen to. What the Ukrainians ought to do is to start broaching through these intermediaries with the Russians a prospect of negotiating peace. It would be on Russia's terms. Vyacheslav Volodin, the Speaker of the Duma, who is, by the way, I've forgotten to mention in previous programs, he's also a member of Russia's Security Council, and of course he's therefore absolutely party to the top political and military decisions made by Russia's leadership. Anyway, Volodin said that what Ukraine needed to do was to capitulate to Russia's terms, or it would in time cease to exist as an independent state. The terms Ukraine would get this time would be very harsh. But the reality is that, barring a miracle, which is not going to happen, even if these problems with the budgets in the United States are sorted out, even if the immediate funding problems for Europe are sorted out, the trajectory is clear. Western support for Ukraine is starting to flag and will continue to do so, and Ukraine's military position and economic position is deteriorating. Throwing lives away, continuing to throw lives away, in the face of Ukraine's spiraling demographic crisis, is not only misguided, it is heartless. It shows no concern for Ukraine's future. And to be frank, what is now at stake is not just Ukraine's continued existence as a state, but perhaps the continued sustainable survival of the Ukrainian nation as a nation within the territory that is now Ukraine. I hate to put things as starkly as this, but that is the direction we're going to. And by the way, I have seen that there are now some comments in some places that these Russian counterattacks, about which the Institute for the Study of War is so dismissive, that they are in fact Russian probing attacks, that the Russians are now starting to sniff, to see where the weaknesses in Ukrainian positions are, and that they are in effect a kind of armed reconnaissance that Russia is preparing on the eve of its own offensive. I don't know whether that is true, but as I said, at some point, unless some kind of negotiation is put in place urgently, and it's clear to me now, it's become crystal clear to me that in the West, for the moment, that is impossible. So that throws it back to Ukraine again. Unless there is some negotiation put in place very soon, a big Russian offensive is going to happen, and Ukraine will at that point face a crisis which it might not survive as a state, or conceivably even as a thriving nation. within the territory that now represents that state. Anyway, we will see what the Ukrainian leadership do. I'm sorry to say that I have little hope of any rational decisions from that quarter. Now, there is one other topic that I want to come to, and it's one that I do so with genuine distaste, but there has been a most extraordinary op-ed in, of all places, Politico. And this goes back to that event in the Canadian Parliament a week ago when a Canadian, Ukrainian, a Mr. Hunka, Yaroslav Hunka, was received with standing ovations in the Canadian Parliament after having meetings with Prime Minister Trudeau and President Zelensky over the course of President Zelensky's visit to Ukraine. And when he was presented to the Canadian Parliament as a Canadian and Ukrainian hero who had fought against the Russians earlier in his life, he being now 98. And of course, as became very clear shortly after, he actually fought against the Russians, as anybody with any knowledge, even casual knowledge of Ukrainian history would have guessed. He fought the Russians as a member of the 14th SS Galicia Division during the Second World War. Now, that has caused massive embarrassment in Canada. The Speaker of the Canadian Parliament has been forced to resign. Prime Minister Trudeau has made apologies, that very, I thought, weak apologies. And of course, he's talked at length about Russian disinformation and Russian propaganda. And I wasn't able to understand the context, what he meant by that. He seemed to urge the media, or he was urging the media, or so it seemed to me, to somehow cover for him in connection with this most embarrassing event. And in fact, there have been a whole series of articles that have appeared in the media in the West, not many, only a few, but nonetheless some, which do seem to have been trying to somehow play down the significance of this affair in the Canadian Parliament, or at least rationalise it or relativise it away. There was one by the BBC, and now I'm afraid there's been one which I simply can't ignore, which is in Politico. Now, some people, I believe it was Matt Taibbi, has said that this is the worst op-ed ever written. Well, I'm not sure that I go that far, but I do find it a very disturbing and extraordinary op-ed. Now, the title of the op-ed says that fighting against the USSR didn't necessarily make you a Nazi. And this relates, of course, to Hunka. No, I should say many people have fought the USSR at various times. It's not the war that was fought during the Second World War between the Soviet Union and Germany and its allies was not the only war in which the Soviet Union was involved. It fought a long insurgency in Afghanistan, for example. It was involved in a fight against Israel in 1970, the so-called War of Attrition that took place then when the Soviets intervened in what is known as Operation Kavkaz to prevent Israeli incursions and air raids beyond the Suez Canal. And this led to actual armed clashes, including clashes between fighter jets, between the Soviet military and the military of Israel. It's a forgotten but important episode. There was border clashes between the USSR and China. So, I mean, saying that not fighting against the USSR didn't necessarily make you a Nazi is simply a statement of the obvious. I mean, it's in Afghanistan, in Israel, obviously, in China, well, they weren't Nazis and they still fought against the USSR. So, I mean, this isn't in itself telling us anything. But of course, this whole article is really about the invitation of Yaroslav Hunka to the Canadian Parliament. But then, of course, we start reading all kinds of really rather concerning things. And one of the things that immediately stood out for me about this article is that though the article refers to Yaroslav Hunka as a former SS trooper and admits that he enlisted in one of the foreign legions of the Waffen-SS during the Second World War, it is extremely careful throughout the rest of the article to avoid naming the unit he fought for by name. The article refers to it as a unit or as a group, doesn't actually refer to it as the 14th SS Division Galicia. Now, that is in itself, I find, rather strange, and it does seem as if there's some kind of an attempt to distance Hunka from this division. But anyway, the article then goes on to say that there's been repeated exhaustive investigations which have led to the conclusion, including by not only the Nuremberg trials, but also the British, Canadian, and even Soviet authorities, which led to the conclusion that no war crimes or atrocities had been committed by this particular unit. This particular unit being, of course, the 14th SS Division Galicia. And then the same thing has been said before, it was said again, during previous investigations of the same group carried out by a Canadian Commission of Inquiry. No evidence was, the evidence apparently that this group, this unit, was involved in war crimes, no evidence about it was found. Now, in both occasions, there's a link. There is a link under these words. I tried to follow the link. That led me to a page which appears to refer to publications of Canada, and you go to, it's a gateway, and it talks about war criminals in Canada, and it covers many different war crimes and war criminals. But suffice to say, I don't find this in itself a completely convincing link to what is said here, because as far as I can tell, what this inquiry was looking at was not at the division itself so much, but rather at the individual members of the division, and whether or not, as individuals, those members of the division who found themselves in Canada had committed war crimes. Now, I've gone to Wikipedia, perhaps a place which many people would not regard as the most reliable, but one which is in general pretty favourable to Ukraine, as I've noticed in many of the articles that it's written. And I've tried to find what is said there about this particular division. And it does seem as if there have been allegations of war crimes made against it, connected to actions that it took in Poland, in Slovakia, and in the former Yugoslavia. And the article in Politico speaks about Mr. Hunka having joined a division in order to fight the Bolsheviks, to fight the Soviets. But the reality seems to be that whilst the division did fight the Soviets on two important occasions in Lviv, and again in the last weeks of the war, much of the time it actually spent during the war, most of the period of its existence, it appears to have been used by the Germans as some kind of internal security force conducting operations in, as I said, Poland, in Slovakia, in Yugoslavia, when, as I said, allegations of war crimes were indeed made. Now, it's important to stress that there's been no war crime allegations against Mr. Hunka himself, but it seems to me that it is a stretch to say that exhaustive investigations have entirely exonerated this division. But anyway, the other thing this article says, which is really most astonishing, at least to me, is that it goes on to speak about how people chose to fight for this division. It was somehow a difficult choice for them, that they enlisted, people like Mr. Hunka enlisted to fight in this division because they were faced with a choice between two terroristic regimes. Someone who had an excruciating choice, didn't necessarily make you a Nazi, just someone who had an excruciating choice over which of these two terror regimes to resist. Now, that makes it into an either-or decision. Either you fought with the Nazis or you fought with the Soviets. But of course, most people in Ukraine, or many people in Ukraine, chose to do neither of these things. Many people in Ukraine didn't like the Soviets, and many people in Ukraine didn't like the Nazis. Now, I don't know what Mr. Hunka's reasons for joining the Galicia division were, but from what I've been able to understand, he did so with some sort of degree of enthusiasm. Anyway, he was a volunteer. He actually volunteered to join this particular unit. And, of course, he made his choice. And most people would say he chose the worst of the two. And, of course, he did so in the context of a war where others decided that they weren't going to make that choice at all. They weren't going to have that choice imposed on them. So, anyway, I find the entire article disturbing. I find it most bizarre. And I have to say that it reminds me, it takes me back to something that happened many years ago in the mid-1980s concerning the then UN, or at least the former UN Secretary General, Kurt Waldheim. Now, Waldheim was from Austria. He was, he and his family opposed the annexation of Austria by Germany, but he nonetheless subsequently joined the party, and he was During the war, he was conscripted into the Wehrmacht, and he became a lieutenant in the Wehrmacht, serving in the command headquarters of General Lohr, who was a German general who ordered war crimes to take place by the forces under his command in the Balkans, where, of course, Waldheim himself was serving. Now, after the war, Waldheim tried to conceal his proximity to Lohr, but after he ceased to be UN Secretary General, and when he stood for election to the presidency of Austria, the fact that he'd been involved so closely with Lohr that there was no evidence that he had himself participated in war crimes became widely known. And there was a storm of criticism, and after he was elected, no Western government would receive him. No Western leader visited Austria during the time when he was president to avoid meeting with Waldheim, as I well remember, and he was not welcome in any Western state. There was an uproar about it. And, of course, as I said before, Waldheim was not himself directly implicated in war crimes. He was implicated purely by proximity to war, to Lohr, General Lohr, and you could argue the same about Hunka. He's not directly implicated in war crimes, but he is implicated again by connection to the SS and to this particular division in which he was involved. And for the record, I understand that the Nuremberg Tribunal has actually resolved that membership of the SS after the start of the war was in effect membership of an organization that was engaged in war crimes. So I have to say, the contrast between the universal condemnation across the West of Waldheim and these apologetics about Hunka is striking. And they do show perhaps the extent to which things have changed as the Second World War and the memory thereof fades into the past. And of course, there's the added factor this time that support for Ukraine has now been the imperative and appears to trump all else. Well, I think this is a shabby article in Politico. I'm not going to say it was the worst op-ed ever written, but I really do find the language and the reasoning appalling. And I'm incredulous that the editors at Politico approved it for publication. I think that in Slovakia, by the way, where the Galicia division was involved in internal policing role, I noticed that Robert Fico has spoken out about the Slovak national rising. This was a courageous rising that took place in Slovakia in 1944 against the German occupation. It was put down mercilessly by the Germans, and Robert Fico has referenced it. And I wonder whether perhaps this affair in the Canadian Parliament relating to a veteran of a division, an SS division, that was stationed in Slovakia for some time, whether that might not also have swayed some votes. To my knowledge, a lot of people in Slovakia do still remember the Slovak national rising with great pride and also with that sense of tragedy that all of the events of the Second World War are remembered. It still resonates. And in fact, even if memory of the Second World War and of its horrors has been fading in the West, it should be said that in Eastern Europe, in Poland, in Slovakia, of course in Russia, in Eastern Ukraine, it resonates still. So anyway, that is all I'm going to say about this this op-ed. As I said, it did shake me to see it there. I would have once thought it inconceivable that such a thing could ever have been written. I will say that I hope that one day there will be a backlash against this kind of thing. I was tempted to think that perhaps there might be, but I noticed that this op-ed has been published with little real response, certainly amongst the bulk of the media in the West. We can already see how Trudeau's call to the media is bearing some pretty awful fruit. And I can't help but think that we're being led into a pretty dark place. Anyway, that's my video for today. More from me soon. We will see what happens in this war and how it turns out and what further action, if any, the Ukrainians take and what the Russian plans are. But this is, as I said, where I end today's video. Just to remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, especially Locals, Rumble and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. And don't forget, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. More from me soon, and have a very good day.